Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm very grateful and deeply touched by being here. And may I say, getting this recognition was a windfall. The last time I got anything from an official agency in Florida was years ago when I got a speeding ticket. So may I say this is a distinct step up in terms of my standing in the state of Florida. And thank you for making that happen, Provost Wilcox. It's a great privilege and something that I'll cherish for a long time to come. Thank you very much. I spent the morning talking to the faculty of the Patel College, and may I say I'm very impressed not only with the vision behind the establishment of the college, but the kinds of subjects that the faculty are working on. And I would say the students who are working in the college must feel deeply privileged, because you're not only getting a very high level of education in terms of what you learn within campus, but also the exposure that you have around the world with all the research projects that are in hand is a distinct asset which I'm sure you'll get to value more and more as time goes on. Well, as you've already heard, I'm going to give you briefly some of the major findings of the 3 working group reports that have been brought out recently by the IPCC. We're now working very hard to complete the synthesis report, which is essentially, as the name suggests, a synthesis of what's contained in the 3 working group reports, plus 2 special reports that we brought out about 3 years ago, less than 3 years ago. One dealing with extreme events and disasters, and the other dealing with renewable energy and climate change mitigation. So what we have in hand currently is, let me turn these things off, if you'll forgive me. So basically, at the end of October, when we finished the synthesis report, we would have completed the 5th assessment cycle of the IPCC. And the IPCC is an organization that was established way back in 1988, essentially as a response to the growing concern that possibly human actions were influencing the climate of this planet. Now, scientists as far back as 150 years ago had postulated the impact of growing carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere and their influence on the climate of the Earth. But for a long period of time, this is an issue that perhaps did not get the attention of the policy community. So it was in 1988 that the United Nations decided to set up the IPCC, but we're not a UN agency. We're an intergovernmental panel. And all our decisions are taken by consensus. So you can imagine you have 195 countries which are members of the IPCC, and not all of them, thank God, attend every meeting, but you know, you have you have 130 plus countries very often. Sometimes they make mistakes. 132 of them elected me as chairman of the IPCC way back in 2002. And they compounded that mistake by re-electing me by acclamation in 2008. So here I am, and I finished my 2nd term by sometime next year. And that means I would have been responsible for overseeing 2 particular assessments of the IPCC. I'll say a little more about the process by which we bring out our assessments, but let me start by essentially highlighting something that Einstein, a person who was perhaps the most brilliant scientist we've had in the world, but more than that, also a human being with an enormous vision of things that went far beyond science, said very eloquently. He said, problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. Today, fortunately, we have the benefit of knowledge and awareness on the basis of which, if we all decide, we can solve this problem. It is within our reach, and that's one of the points that I'd like to convey at the end of my presentation. Now, the Working Group 1 report essentially deals with the physical science basis of climate change. And there are some very profound findings that we came up with, which I'll just run through with you. 95% certainty that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And we use the term extremely likely, that it's extremely likely that human actions have been responsible for most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century. And when we use the term extremely likely, it conveys a probability of over 95%. In the previous assessment, we made a similar statement, but we said very likely, and that represents a probability of over 90%. So therefore, in the period of these 6 years since the last report came out, and the one that we brought out, this Working Group 1 report, which came out in September of last year, we have been able to arrive at a much higher level of confidence on the link between human actions and changes in the climate. And since the 50s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So what is really significant is the fact that human activities have influenced the climate of this planet in a very short period of time and in a very intensive way, which is totally out of the trend that you have seen over millennia. And this trend was essentially that of a fairly stable climate. Of course, there are always fluctuations in the weather. There are fluctuations in temperature, which are the result of a whole range of drivers. But what's particularly important is the fact that we have affected the trend. And this trend is something that would lead to impacts, which I'll elaborate on in a little while. Then limiting climate change will require sustained and substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, here you see the changes in temperature that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization, converted into decadal values. And you find that the last 3 decades have been the warmest, successively warmer than the previous ones. So, therefore, it is important for us to remember that this trend is clearly becoming far more pronounced. And in the last 3 decades, as you can see over here, the trend has been each decade being successively warmer than the previous one. And what has been the effect of this change in climate? Well, the oceans have warmed and risen, and that's because of thermal expansion of the oceans and the melting of all the bodies of ice across the globe. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased in this period of time. What has been the extent of increase? Well, if you look at global average upper ocean heat content, as it happens, the oceans have been absorbing a large amount of the heat that's been generated as a result of anthropogenic increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. Between 71 and 2010, about 90% of the energy accumulated has gone into the oceans. So as a result, the oceans have warmed significantly from the surface down to a depth of about 700 meters. And that warming is continuing because it's going to take several decades and perhaps centuries for the ocean to warm uniformly and go down to the depth, the deepest points of the oceans. So, in a sense, the oceans have taken up a lot of the heat that's been generated as a result of the forcings that have taken place due to the increase in the concentration of these gases. Or else, the surface of the earth would have been much warmer. And the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. In fact, between the beginning of the last century and 2010, there's been a sea level increase of 19 centimeters. That's close to a foot. And you can imagine there are parts of the world which are low-lying coastal areas, they are small island states, and some of them are barely a meter above sea level. That means maybe a yard or a little more above sea level. And therefore, an increase of about a foot in the sea level is something that has implications even before you're faced with the danger of complete submergence. Why? Simply because every time there's a storm surge, every time there's coastal flooding, it's going to be that much more severe simply because the sea level is much higher. So these are manifestations of climate change which clearly we have to be concerned about. Now, if you look at what the world is doing to deal with this problem, see the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. At the start of industrialization, we had 280 parts per million of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. In May of last year, it crossed the barrier of 400 parts per million. So there's been a huge increase in a very short period of time. And CO2 is not the only gas. There are other greenhouse gases also, the concentration of which has increased. And as the first fact over here mentioned, this particular slide tells you, these three, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the past 800,000 years. And the ocean has absorbed 30% of the emitted anthropogenic carbon dioxide, and this has led to ocean acidification. Now that has serious implications simply because that's going to affect marine ecosystems. It's going to affect various forms of marine life. And to be honest, we really haven't studied this adequately. And we would have to get, the jury is still out, and we have to get much better scientific assessment of how this ocean acidification is going to affect everything that's below the ocean, not only living species, but also several ecosystems which obviously are going to be affected. And there's already evidence on coral reefs, for instance, which are being damaged and certainly affected by the impacts of ocean acidification. Then CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, combustion and industrial processes contributed about 78% of the total greenhouse gas emissions increased from 1970 to 2010. So these are two sources where there's been a very rapid increase, and we need to be concerned about that. If you look at other sources of emissions, here is a picture that tells you that, for instance, AFOLU stands for agriculture, forestry, and land use. That in itself accounts for almost a quarter of the emissions that are taking place, and that have taken place between 2000 and 2010. The others are, of course, industry, transport, energy, and so on. Economic growth and population increase have certainly been the important drivers of increase in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And therefore, this is an area that we would have to focus on in bringing about mitigation. And these are expected to continue because otherwise we'll see, if we don't do anything about it, emissions will continue to grow, and we would necessarily face much more severe impacts of climate change in the future. Continued emissions will lead to increase in warming of the oceans during the 21st century. And it's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperature rises. I've been to the Arctic myself on a few occasions, and I'm going there again at the end of next month. And you get not only anecdotal information, but a whole lot of other data to show how Arctic sea ice cover is being affected. And we projected, as a matter of fact, that by 2050, September Arctic sea ice is likely to vanish. And September is the month when you have the lowest sea ice cover in the Arctic, simply because during the summer months there is some melting. But it's melting at such a rapid rate that by the middle of this century, you might see a complete absence of Arctic sea ice. And global glacier volume will further decrease. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century. The other thing that is an issue to be concerned about is the increase in certain extreme events. The length, frequency, and or intensity of warm spells or heat waves will increase over most land areas. So much so that those heat waves, which currently take place once in 20 years in some parts of the world, will occur once in 2 years. So that obviously is a major change to which human society will have to adapt. And similarly, heavy precipitation events are on the increase both in frequency and intensity. And this will continue unless we bring about mitigation of greenhouse gases. Now, if you have these extreme precipitation events, there are several implications that we have to be concerned with. One is, of course, the fact that there would be a risk to life and property every time you get a heavy amount of rainfall or snowfall. There's clearly a threat to human as well as ecological systems because you'll have flooding, you'll have landslides, you'll have avalanches in the case of heavy snowfall, and that is clearly a threat. But more than that, there are implications in respect of availability of water. Because if, let's say, you've got a system where you've got stable and reasonably uniform rainfall during a certain period of time, if that's going to be replaced by sudden, sharp, and heavy periods of precipitation, then that has major implications for availability of water and our access to water resources. So these are issues that we need to keep in mind. I remember when I came through immigration yesterday, the immigration officer asked me what I was doing, and I told him, he says, but where is global warming? He says, we've had the coldest winter in this particular season. And I had to tell him that I never use the term global warming simply because it conveys the impression that all you're talking about is a warming of temperatures. But climate change is much wider. And what we're seeing is changes in the climate. And I told him, look, one season doesn't mean anything at all. You've got to look at the trend. So he stamped my passport and he let me through. He just thought I was someone that he didn't want to have a conversation with. So anyway. What are some of the other projected risks for natural systems of freshwater resources? There would be a significant reduction of renewable surface water and groundwater resources in most subtropical regions. Climate change is projected to pose risks to raw and drinking water quality. Terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, increased extinction risk under all warming scenarios, increased tree mortality, forest dieback with risks for ocean storage, biodiversity, wood production and economic activity, submergence and coastal flooding, erosion due to sea level rise. So, there are a whole range of economic impacts that have economic and certainly ecological implications. Again, since I spend the best part of my life at airports or in sitting on planes, yesterday I saw on CNN there was a story about what's going to happen to coffee plantations across the globe, and this is something that I have personally studied myself. The impacts of climate change on coffee cultivation could be adverse, could be negative. And of course, the discussion on television was about how prices of coffee might go up. And this really means that perhaps we have to cut down on coffee consumption if we're confronted with higher prices, or maybe move to other substitutes. And I wouldn't recommend any specific substitute, it's your personal preference. Marine systems, redistribution and reduction of global marine species and biodiversity with challenges for fisheries, because clearly with warming of the oceans, with changing of even the acidification content, you see in several parts of the world fish moving from their natural habitat to other locations where conditions would be more favorable and are getting more favorable for them. I remember a few years ago when I went to the Maldives Islands, which incidentally are a major exporter of tuna fish. They told me that they're just not getting the same catch that they used to, simply because a large part of that stock has moved. So, there's going to be this kind of migration of species, and it's already happening. Expansion of dead zones with constraints for fish habitat, polar ecosystems, and coral reefs at substantial risk, and so on. Food security would be affected because the impacts on agriculture we have found in this assessment are already quite serious. And if climate change continues, they're going to become much more pronounced. The negative impacts for wheat, rice, and maize production in some regions for local temperature increases of 2 degrees Celsius. And in fact, this decrease in yields is already occurring even with the temperature increases that we have today. So there would be impacts on livelihoods and poverty, slowing down of economic growth. And this can happen in a variety of ways. For instance, if there's going to be an adverse impact on agriculture that affects the lives and livelihoods of a large number of people across the globe, extreme events can have a major impact. Some of you might remember that in 2003 there was a very serious and severe heat wave in Europe, as a result of which a large number of people died. When you have extreme precipitation events, there's a major economic implication. You saw that with Superstorm Sandy. You saw that with the floods in the UK this year. And if you go back in time 2 years ago, roughly, you had this massive flood in Thailand. And the impact of that was not only confined to Thailand and Bangkok, but even to Japan, because companies like Toyota source a lot of their automobile parts from Bangkok, and when the factories over there shut down because of the flood, that had a direct impact on production in the major automobile manufacturers in Japan. So, in an integrated, in an interconnected world, anything that happens in one part of the globe has implications for other regions as well. And this is something that is economically important, but it also has various other dimensions, both ecological and human. Now, therefore, what we really need to do is to develop climate-resilient pathways, and I'm very happy to see that the Patel College is working on some of these issues, that combine adaptation and mitigation to reduce climate change and its impacts. Because since mitigation reduces the time and magnitude of warming, it also increases the time available for adaptation to a particular level of climate change, potentially by several decades. So therefore, you really need a combination of mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation alone will not work, because we'll reach certain thresholds and certain tipping points beyond which adapting further would become extremely challenging. And similarly, mitigation will not work by itself, simply because there's a certain inertia in the system, as a result of which climate change will continue for several decades, even if you had very stringent mitigation actions taken in hand immediately. So you need a combination of both to create the kind of resilience that societies have to develop. Now, in baseline scenarios, without additional mitigation efforts, direct CO2 emissions from the energy supply sector are expected to almost double or even triple by 2050 compared to 2010. And I want to tell you that today, in 2010, we had emissions of greenhouse gases at the level of 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And 10 gigatons was the increase that took place between 2000 and 2010. So roughly an increase of 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent each year. And therefore, to be able to deal with this serious problem, you have to take in hand major mitigation efforts. Otherwise, we could get doubling or even tripling of emissions from energy supply, CO2 emissions from energy supply by the middle of this century. And this results in significant increases in indirect emissions from electricity use in the buildings and industry sectors. You see, this is, in a sense, a kind of a vicious circle. When you have higher temperatures, then you also need more air conditioning. And you must remember there are parts of the world where incomes are increasing. People have not had air conditioning at all in the past. With higher incomes and with the higher temperatures, they would obviously be installing much more air conditioning than we have today. And infrastructure developments and long-lived products that lock societies into GHG-intensive emissions pathways may be difficult or very costly to change. And this is true of buildings in particular. If we design and construct buildings which are locked into a high level of energy intensity, it's very difficult to change them. Buildings have an economic life, which is not like going and changing your washing machine or your motor car. You really are stuck with buildings. A politician who is not entirely a great favorite of mine, Winston Churchill, a great man, no doubt, once said that we shape buildings and then buildings shape us. And that's a fact, because we have the opportunity to shape buildings in such a way that indirectly they would also shape the way we use energy and other resources. And this is something that we need to put in place in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, benchmarks, standards that are laid down. You know, you see that in the case of automobile fuel efficiency standards, but you really need to apply these across the board. And while buildings in some places are being made far more efficient than in the past, there's a huge amount of potential which has yet to be exploited. Now, if we have to reach levels of 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent by 2100, which is what we need to keep temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, then we need to lower global greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 than in 2100. So it'll be about 40 to 70% lower globally. And emissions levels near 0 gigatons of CO2 equivalent or below in 2100. So basically, in order to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius or below, you would have to enter a zone of negative emissions before the end of this century. Now, it can be done, but it'll take a lot of hard work. It'll take an enormous global effort to bring this about. And you need more rapid improvements in energy efficiency, and almost trebling or quadrupling of the share of zero and low carbon energy supply from renewables by 2050. So we have this window of opportunity of within this 36-year period of bringing about a rapid shift in energy supply by which we move to low or zero carbon energy sources. And nuclear energy, biomass, fossil energy with CCS, carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy and CCS by the year 2050 are the options that are available to us. And I think each society will have to decide what it wants to adopt. Now, we have a number of scenarios of different levels that would be reached by 2100. And this will require efforts to reduce deforestation, major afforestation efforts, and deployment of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. But of course, the availability and scale of these and other reduction technologies are uncertain and associated with challenges and risks. So if we want a certain outcome, say by the middle of this century, and then of course by the end of this century, we need to put in place policies and measures today by which the market gets signals, consumers get signals, and we start moving in the right direction. So really speaking, what we have assessed in these pathways by which mitigation can take place clearly indicate that action has to be taken urgently and adequately today. Now, fortunately, there are a whole range of co-benefits. Mitigation scenarios reaching around 450 ppm CO2 equivalent concentrations by 2100 show large-scale global changes in the energy supply sector. There will be systemic and cross-sectoral mitigation strategies which would be needed because these are most cost-effective. You can't just focus on specific sectors. You really need something wider across the entire economy. And at the energy system level, these include reductions in GHG emissions intensity in the energy supply sector, a switch to low-carbon energy carriers, and reductions in energy demand in the end-use sectors without compromising development. What are the end-use sectors? Take transport, for instance, buildings, industry, of course. And most importantly, we also need to bring about some changes in lifestyles. That, again, is an important mitigation option that the world has to consider. We need to reduce energy demand. We need to provide more flexibility for carbon intensity reduction in the energy supply sector, hedge against related supply side risks, avoid lock-in to carbon intensive infrastructures, because once you've established infrastructure for a certain set of technologies and practices, to change them becomes very difficult. Just to give you an example, if let's say you want to go in for electric vehicles, you would have to set up the infrastructure by which these can be charged in a manner that doesn't disrupt your day-to-day transportation systems. But once you set up that kind of infrastructure, you've reduced the options by which you can use something else. So this is true of, let's say, the competition between road and rail traffic. If you've set up highways, you've set up automobile manufacture and an entire infrastructure which is based on the use of private automobiles or automobiles for any kind of purpose, then to change that becomes very difficult because it's also politically much more difficult. On the other hand, I give the example of the city of Zurich, which has excellent public transport. You get off at the airport, you don't need to step into a car at all because public transport takes you everywhere, every corner of the city, and almost every hour of the day or night. So, therefore you have an infrastructure and at the same time you've got some very heavy taxes on the ownership and registration of cars by which people make very rational choices. They don't need cars. They just use public transport. And if you need a car, you rent it and go out on the weekend. It's much cheaper to do that than to keep a car at home. If you have a supply system by which you can get milk in the supermarket, you're not going to keep a cow in your garage. So, these are things that obviously we have to do consciously when you establish infrastructure. Then there are huge co-benefits. What we really need to focus on is renewables, nuclear, CCS, and our projections show that these will increase from about 30% today to more than 80% by 2050. Now, every country, every society will have to exercise rational choices. Fossil fuel power generation without CCS will be phased out almost entirely by 2100. Now, with CCS, yes, if you can employ carbon capture and storage, then you can use fossil fuels for power generation. And renewable energy technologies will be deployed at significant scale. Nuclear could make an increasing contribution, and replacement of current world average coal-fired power plants with modern, highly efficient natural gas combined cycle power plants or combined heat power plants. So these are some of the elements of the scenarios by which we'll be able to bring about mitigation in the future. And I won't go into this because these are just some characteristics of CCS and bioenergy plus CCS, BECCS. The good news is that the cost of bringing about this kind of mitigation is not going to be very high. For instance, in 2030, the loss in global consumption would be about 1.7% of the global GDP. In 2050, it would be 3.4%, and in 2100, 4.8%. Now, if you consider this, if you consider these figures, then really, this is not a very high price to pay for avoiding and doing away with some of the worst impacts of climate change. So I think we need to take a rational view of climate policy by which we adapt and make sure that we minimize the impacts of climate change by mitigation. So the costs over here are clearly not difficult or daunting. And these are some of the core benefits: improved energy efficiency and energy security, cleaner energy sources, air quality and human health will be far better, reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas, sustainable agriculture and forestry, protection of ecosystems for carbon storage. So if you carry out effective mitigation, there's a whole host of core benefits which are listed over here that also make it far more attractive to pursue this pathway. And finally, Gandhi said two important things. He said the technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. So this goes back to what I showed initially and what Einstein said. Problems cannot be solved at the level of awareness that created them. Now that we have awareness, we have knowledge, we certainly don't have to live through catastrophes. We need to anticipate them and act in a way that we avoid them. And you know, the world is so focused on GDP growth, on consuming and producing more and more. But clearly speaking, we are imposing a lot of externalities, both on human systems as well as ecosystems. And therefore, what we need is a better method by which we assess and measure human progress. And if we don't do that, then I think what Gandhi said is right. Speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. And if you're going in the wrong direction, there's no point in saying we are growing at X percentage a year in terms of GDP. Well, if that's going to impose a huge lot of externalities which are negative, then clearly you are going in the wrong direction. And to sort of beat your chest and say we're doing very well is totally irrelevant. So I'll stop here and I'd be very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.